And there's a couple of things that we're going to cover. We're going to do some programming in Python. If you're familiar with the language, it will be fairly straightforward to begin with. If you're not, then I've got templates for everything, and it should be nice and easy to get hold of. We're going to talk about something called a CSV file. We're going to look at opening and reading files in Python, and what a list is in Python and how we use them. We're going to do a bit of randomizing. We're going to build some functions that we can reuse, and we're going to do some formatting of strings, some tidying of outputs so it looks all nice and neat. Those are the basics we're going to cover, and we're going to do it by generating some insults because that's entertaining and silly. Before you start though, you're going to need to have Python installed, and there's a set of additional resource files, including this PowerPoint, which you don't necessarily need because you can grab it all from the website and you can write all the code by hand, but it will speed a whole load of stuff up. It's entirely up to you whether you use those resources or whether you want to do it all by hand yourself. I'll show you how to do it all by hand, but it is your decision which way you go. I would suggest you use all those templates and you do the modifying as I do in the video, because it's just quicker and it gets you to thinking computationally quicker, because actually typing isn't the big deal. Thinking about how to solve the problem is. I'm going to show you really quickly how to install Python if you haven't already. If you go to python.org or just type Python into Google, it's the first result. And then you go to downloads right here and then click on Python 3.9.5 and install it. It works on Windows and Macs. It looks basically exactly the same on both. There are also versions of Python that you can stick on a mobile device or a tablet. If you want to do your coding on devices like that, it's a little more awkward, but those apps exist and they work. And there's also some web-based platforms where you can just type your code into a web browser and that all works really nicely. But I'm going to be showing you the default install of Python and how all of that works. So you go to python.org, hit download, install it all, and then there's a piece of software that comes with Python called idle, and it will pop up in your start menu. And when you open it, it just looks like this. And as a really straightforward thing, what I tend to do is I tend to pop this window over here on the left, and then I go to File and New, and this makes a blank empty file for me to work with, and I pop that on the right. The reason, as you'll see in a minute, is this is called the shell, and this kind of tells us what's going on and shows us some outputs, and this is my actual Python file and my actual Python code. So once you've got all those things set up, you're ready to go. And I'm just going to take you through this in 7 different sections. I'll show you a slide like this, a little overview, and then we'll get on with it. So generating insults, there's a silly document on this website which just talks you through Shakespearean insults, and it gives you some examples from his plays, and it gives you a little model for how you can generate Shakespearean sounding insults. So the link takes you to this website, and if you look down the bottom here, we have Shakespearean insults just here, and if you click, it opens this file up. You can take your time and read this if you want to. Hit pause on the video and have a little look to get a sense of what's going on. But essentially, it's really simple. This first page explains it, and the second page has 3 lists. And what we do is we just pick something from list A, something from list B, and something from list C, and we put them together, and that's our insults. So I might pick infectious, dismal, dreaming nuthook. And that's my insult. You're an infectious, dismal, dreaming nuthook. Now that's great, but this is a thing that we can really use a computer to work with, because picking random things from lists, computers are really good at that, and they're really quick at that, much quicker than we would be, and much better at being random than we would be. So you're probably more likely to maybe pick from the middle of each list. You're more likely to kind of go across like this, rather than going all over the place. You're not going to completely pick in a random way, but a computer is. So we can use a computer to do this in a much more organized and thorough way. So that's what's going on. You can download the PDF file yourself and get ready to generate that list. But actually that PDF file is not in a very good format for us to pull that information out and use in a program. So I'm going to show you really quickly something called a CSV. CSV just stands for comma separated variables. And it's a file format that is used all the time when people are using data-driven software, because it's really standardized across all platforms. It's a really simple file format, and it works really, really effectively for what we're doing. But I suspect a lot of you won't have seen one before. So what I want to do is I'm just going to open up a spreadsheet. And you probably have seen a spreadsheet before. All a spreadsheet does is it organizes data into cells in a giant table. So this cell's A1, this cell's B1, this cell's B2, and so on. And if I type in a word in each of those two cells, if I hit save, it saves it in a spreadsheet format. Only a spreadsheet bit of software can open it. And that's also not terribly useful for interacting with programming languages, because they would have to know how to decipher that spreadsheet file format. But actually what we've stored is really, really simple. It's just 2 bits of text. And what I can do is, if I hit File and then Save As, and then I pop it in a folder. If you're aware of this, but you can type a file name in, but you can also click this box and change the file type. And there's all sorts of different file types Excel will save to. What I'm going to do is just scroll down to this one that says CSV UTF-8. That's just the text format. And then it says comma delimited. If I change it to that, then hit save. You see up the top here it says hello.csv, and I've just created this hello.csv file right here. If I open this in Notepad instead of Excel, you see what's happened is we've got the text hello and world, and they are just separated by a comma. So comma separated variables literally means take all of your data one piece at a time and just stick a comma in between them. Okay, CSV, comma separated variables, and that's it. And this file is just a text file, which means pretty much any software can open it and read it and interpret it really, really easily. So that's very, very convenient. What would be helpful though is how do we create a CSV of that data that we had? So I can type a CSV by hand in some text editor, or I can use Excel to create it just like I've done. Now what would be really convenient would be grabbing this data and putting it into a CSV file, and I can use Excel to do that as well. And really, really simple. If I just click, drag and select, I'm going to do it a column at a time rather than the whole thing, just to show you exactly what's going on. But you could do this all in one. I've selected all. I'm going to right click and click copy, and then I'm going to go to Excel and just delete those. If I just click paste, that doesn't look right. It's pasted it all in one huge long line, and it's not separated out nicely at all. So I'm just going to delete that, and I'm going to try again. If I right click and click paste special, all of the Office software will have this option. A lot of other software will let you do similar, and it just gives me some additional options for how I might paste it. And the default is HTML. Doesn't really matter what that means or what that looks like. What does matter is it's quite often convenient to switch to text, and it will then paste it as is without any formatting. And what that does is it just includes the new line characters that are in the PDF file that move things down a line. And you can see now my list is in a column like that. And if you do the same thing for the other two columns, copy and paste special as text into these two columns, and then do file, save as, and remember to change it to a CSV file, what you will get is this file, insults.csv, Now this is in the resource pack, so if you don't feel like building the CSV yourself, it doesn't matter, it's already here ready for you to use. If you do want to use your own, make your own, or even just write your own insults out, that's absolutely fine. You can just add more lines to this file or open it in a text editor and add more lines to the file that way. It's really, really straightforward. So that's how we generate our CSV file. Now, we need to take that file, open it, read it in Python, find out what's in the file. File handling is part of GCC, so if you did GCC, you would have done this yourself. And I have a file in the resources called section 4 reading files.py as a starting point for you. So if we go to Python and if I open up reading files, this is what we have. Type it all out yourself if you want to, or use this. And what we have is, let me just talk through the elements here. So I've got file. This is a variable because when I open the file, I want to save it somewhere in the program. So a variable is just a location to save some current data. So my data in the file is being put into this variable here called file. And I'm saying file is, so this is what I'm saving into file. This is called an assignment statement, pretty straightforward. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to open insults.csv, that is just the file name. And this little R means read. I'm going to open it in read mode because I just want to read contents of the file. I don't want to do anything fancy. I don't want to edit it. I just want to open it and find out what's inside it. This is standard Python, a standard Python instruction. You can see that the word open appears in kind of a purpley color because it's a keyword. Python understands it and recognizes it. Most text editors for coding will do this thing called syntax highlighting, where they go, oh, this is this kind of word, and so I'll give it this kind of color. You can see that the stuff inside the speech marks has appeared in green because they are bits of text. Then you can just kind of see what's going on because of all the coloring. Now, what this line of code does is it opens the file up, but it doesn't look inside the file. It just opens it on the computer in Python, ready to do something with. Because we might want to read the whole file, we might want to just read a bit of the file, we might want to change some contents of the file or write some stuff or add some stuff to it and not really care about what's in it already. So depending on what you want to do is what comes next. File does contain the file itself, but it doesn't directly contain the text. It's like the whole file stored in the computer, but it's not, we're not looking inside it to see what's inside it. But we want to. What we want is to read the information in the file. So we have a second variable here called contents, and in that variable I'm going to store the text that's inside the file. And I do that by saying, well, get the file which we saved stuff in, and then dot. So dot after a variable means we're about to do something to that variable using something called a method. And so when we write dot, file dot, we're saying take file and then do the thing after the dot. And this has to be a standard pre-written method. We can't just make it up. The computer has to understand it. But files have this method called read. We need brackets afterwards to tell it that it's a method that we're trying to do something with. Even though the brackets are empty, we need them. And what this will do is it will take the file and it will read the entire contents of the file and it will store them into this variable contents. And then the final thing we're going to do is we're going to print, which means output to the shell, to the console right here, what's in this variable. Now if I just run that, so run module, what we should see is that it does some stuff here, opens the file, it says squeeze text 50 lines because the file is huge. If I double click, it will show me, oh look, that's the content of that CSV file. And that's not surprising. We hopefully recognize that this is the same list of the insult words. A little note here, we've also done file.close. When you open a file on the computer, I don't know if you know this or not, but the computer locks that file down and prevents anybody else from opening it. So that if you make some changes, someone else can't have it open, make some other changes and both save them at once, and it all get a bit confused and messy. So we open a file, we have a look inside it, and then when we're done, we have to close the file. Otherwise, it remains locked and nobody else can access it, including us if we try and do something else in a different piece of software. So closing files is a really important habit to be in when you're playing around with data inside files. And that's it. It's really, really simple. Now, what I want to do is I want to suggest that you also experiment with other ways of reading information. So read takes the entire contents of the file, but there's another method called read line. And I'm not going to show you what that does. What I want you to do now is to pause the video, to change this to read line, and to find out what that does instead of just read. So pause the video, get that file open or type it all out yourself and run it and see what happens. And actually, a really good strategy for this is to predict what will happen first and then run it and see if your prediction was correct. And if your prediction was correct, then you can play around and think about, well, what can I change instead? Can I do something else? What happens if I make another variable called more contents equals file.readline, and then I print more contents as well? Maybe you experiment with that, just see what happens and see how it all works out. Okay, so that is section 4. How do we open and read a file? You have a little play around, and then when you're ready, hit play. Okay, so the 5th step in this process, and there were only 7, it's not going to take much longer to get to where we need to be, is we want to create and use a list. Now a list is just, well, it's a list. It's not a complicated idea, but it's a data structure in Python which allows us to save data one piece of information at a time and then access all that data at any point we want to. We're not going to spend ages looking at these, but we're just going to look at some of the basics of how to create lists. We're going to make an empty list and then chuck stuff into that list. The template for this is section 5, creating lists.py. So if I pull that open now, what you'll see is there's quite a lot of changes from section 4, but there's a couple of things that are still the same as they were before. So hopefully you'll notice that this line, file equals open, is identical. It's exactly the same thing we had before, and there's no great change here. We open the file in read mode, we store it in this variable, ready to open it and have a look. And what we're going to do is I've actually set 3 lists up: list A, list B, list C, because what I really want is the 3 columns of of insults to be stored in 3 separate lists, so I can pick up random from each list and then glue those things together. To make an empty list, this is all we do. Lists in Python are denoted by these square brackets. So if I say list A equals some empty square brackets, Python knows now that A is a list, and it's empty, there's nothing in it, but it's ready to add stuff to. So this just generates 3 completely empty lists with no things in them. Okay, I've just cleared the shell so that we're ready to go. And then let me talk about these, and we'll run it and we'll see what happens, and then I'll give you a couple of things to play around with and sort. So we've got this thing here, for line in file. What this does is really, really simple. This looks at every single line inside the file one at a time, and it just reads them into a variable called line. This is called a for loop or iteration, and we'll talk about this in a bit more detail in just a second, but essentially for every line in the file, we'll run these 2 lines of code once, and then we'll start again and we'll run them again. What I'm doing is I'm doing line.split, and then I put in the brackets this comma. Split does exactly what you'd expect. It takes a line and splits it, it separates it up where it sees a comma. So this is actually the main reason we really like CSV files, is because it's really easy to pull a line apart into individual pieces because we know there's a comma in between every bit of data. So I do line.split, and that means that words actually also ends up being a list, but it ends up being a list of individual items of data. So words is a list of data items, and every time I go through a line in my file, words is that line split up. So the first time I run this, it's the first line in the file. The second time I run it, it's the second line, and the third line, and the fourth line, and so on. So this variable line gets updated every time I redo my loop. And basically this will just keep going until I reach the end of the file and there are no more lines. And then it will go, oh, I'm done, I've finished, I've looked at all of them, I'll stop. So words is a little mini list of the 3 different insults, because remember, every line contains 3 different insult bits, 1 from each column. And what we're going to do is we're going to say list A, remember we made this blank list here, dot append. The word append just means add to the end. And I'm going to add to the end words 0. Now, I'm not going to talk in detail about why that is, but what this does, or what it should do, is it should add the first of the 3 insult pieces in to that list A. And after my loop is finished, I've gone through every line in the file, and every single time I've added the first word to that list A. I'm just going to print list A. And remember, close the file at the end. So if I run this, run, what we get is, we get this list. We can see it's a list because it's got these square brackets around it, and it's a list of single words, and these are just the first insult words from every line in that file. Okay, so what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to take this file and I'd like you to fill in list B and list C as well. It's a fairly small modification. This line of code adds the first word to list A every time. So you need to think about and experiment with, how do I add the second word or the third word instead? And how do I add them to list B and list C instead? And probably, to make sure it's all working, we also want to print out list B and list C as well, just so we can double check everything's working. If I run this again, you'll see list A all filled in, list B and C empty. Okay, so we need to do that. Pause the video, have a bit of a play around with this code, try and work out how to fill list B and list C in with those words as well. Okay, so you've had a play around with that. Hopefully you've got that working. The next step is we don't just want 3 lists of words. What we want is to be able to select randomly from each of those lists. We want a different insult every time, and we want it to be done at random. It's very easy in Python. Random number generation is pretty straightforward. And again, there's a template for this to start us off, which is section 6 random choice.py. So let's just get my shell open and get random choice open. Now, what I've got right here is this code right here does what we wanted it to do from before. I'm now adding the words to list B and list C properly. So I've got our 3 blank lists, I've got my file open, this is all the same as before, I split each line up, and now I'm adding them all to those 3 lists. And I'm doing one more thing now, which is I'm running this thing called insult me. Now, insult me is elsewhere in our code, and it's actually right here. So we're creating something now called a function. A function in Python is just a set of instructions which we give a name to. And when we write that name down, it runs this set of instructions. So anytime we want to, we can just say, oh, could you run this please? And it will run it. I'm going to show you why I've done that in just a moment. But what we really want to do is we want to look at what's going on inside this insult me function and see how it's working. And what we do is we say word A equals, and then I've got this thing called random.choice, and then in brackets list A. Now remember, list A is just that first set of insult words from column A in our list. Random.choice means, unsurprisingly, randomly choose one thing from this list. Really, really simple, really, really obvious. That's all it is. Now, Python needs to know what random is, and actually random doesn't exist by default in Python. So we've also got this line right at the top that says import random. Somebody else, somebody very clever, has written a set of instructions for generating random numbers in all sorts of interesting ways. And they saved all that information in something called a library. And loads of these libraries exist to do all sorts of really useful things. And this line of code just goes, open the random library up so that we can use it. And therefore we're allowed to use the random library to pick something from a list. And then we're just going to print out. And hopefully it's fairly obvious that what's going to happen is it's going to pick a random word from list A and print it out. Now the reason I have written this in a function instead of just putting it down at the bottom of the code is now that I've run my code, the shell remembers my function, remembers my code. And I haven't really explored the shell yet, but the shell knows everything that's just run in our program. So it knows what list A is. If I type list A, it says what it is. It also knows, for example, what file is. Oh, look, file is this insults.csv thing. It still says that because we haven't closed the file, which is a bit naughty of us. We really ought to do file.close. If I run this again, it will go same thing, but it's all closed. And insult me as a function, well, I can just run it again and again and again and again, and you can see every single time it's picking out a different random word from that list A. That's great, that's useful, that's really helpful. It's not brilliant though, because what we actually want is all three words. And if you read the PDF file right at the start, what we actually want is, instead of printing out word A, we want it to print out thou, and then we want it to print out word A, and then we want it to print out, oh, well, we don't have the other two words picked. So actually, I'm going to leave that as an exercise to you. How do you get it to generate a word from all three lists and print all of those things out? Now, at the moment, it's going to print thou and then the word on separate lines. That's fine for right now. Let's just work with that, because as long as we can get random choices working and we can pick from the three different lists, we're nearly there. So I'm going to pause for a moment, finish that job off, get it picking a random one from all three lists, and then in just a moment, we'll finish off the last little bit of the problem. Okay, so the final step in this process, we're nearly there, is formatting our output. Because actually, it would be really helpful if we could get it all on one line instead of on multiple lines, and it'd be nice if it was just kind of tidy and in the way we want it, with spaces and easy to read. So we've just got to do a little bit of work on formatting strings. We're not going to do very complicated stuff here because string formatting is a huge, complicated topic. Yeah, let's have a quick look at formatting strings. Now I've added in word B equals, word C equals. Hopefully this is where you got to with your code. And then what I've done is, instead of just printing things one at a time, I've actually saved the whole thing in a variable. So I've said insult equals, and then I've got the text thou in speech marks, and then I've added word A, added word B, and added word C. Because these things are all just bits of text, the plus sign just joins them together, it jams them together, and then after making the whole insult, I'm going to print the insult. Okay, so there's nothing big and complicated and surprising going on here. Forgot to close the file on this one as well, apparently. Nothing big and surprising going on here. If I run this, what you'll get is thou mangled half-faced nuthook, which is lovely. And just like before, I can rerun that and get thou jarring weather-bitten oxcomb. Lovely. Okay, except it's not lovely at all, is it? There's no spaces. So what I can do is I can add a little extra bit in here. This right here, because of the speech marks, it means what's inside is a string, and what's in that string is a space. So I'm adding the word thou, and then I'm adding a space, and then I'm adding word A. Okay, and if I run that now, oh look, my space has appeared, which is great. Okay, so it is a tiny little job now for you to take what you had before and modify it so that it puts them all together in one nice line with the correct gaps and spaces in between different things so that it's more readable. So take a moment to finish off the project by tidying up your little code so the output's nice and neat and tidy. And I'm just going to leave you with these as some thoughts. You could do a whole bunch of things to extend this idea. You could add some more insults of your own. You could make the output a bit prettier somehow. You could make the program reusable. So after it's finished insulting you, it could say, do you want another insult? And you could type yes, and the program stops if you say no. Or a more substantial, much more interesting extension is to create some kind of GUI, graphical user interface for the program. There are loads of ways of doing this. There are some really simple ways kind of built into Python. There are some much more complicated ways you can do that. All sorts of ways you can build graphical interfaces. But the advantage of graphical interfaces, anyone can use it. They don't have to understand how Python works. They can just open it, click a button, get the information. So those are possible things that you could take and do with this code. There's all sorts of ways you could extend this idea. I hope you found this interesting. And I hope it's given you a little bit of a flavour of what computer science is like at A level.